Good morning, Ruth Gilligan. I'm very happy to welcome you here and have this conversation with you on your work. I want to thank you for being here today in Grenoble, and thank you also SFR Création and Massy, which are the Structure Fédérative Recherche Création here at Université de Grenoble Alpes, and the Massy, in which building we are, which is the Maison de la Création et de l'Innovation on the campus of Université de Grenoble Alpes. So you're here for 2 weeks as a writer in a residency, and usually you are a professor of creative writing at the University of Birmingham. You are the author of 2 novels, 2 published novels, Nine Falls Make a Paper Swan, published in 2016, and The Butchers, published in 2020, which was published at Le Seuil by under the title Les Champs Brisés, and which won the Entretien Prize in 2021. So I thought we might begin this conversation not actually talking about those books, because we already did a podcast on those 2 books a few years back for the Ephasis podcast. But I thought it might be a good idea to discuss your current projects. And I think you are in process of completing a novel.
Yes, I am. Thanks, Marie. And it's really lovely to be here. Very delighted to be in Grenoble, and very grateful to everyone who made it possible. So yes, I am just finishing a new novel. And I must confess, it isn't actually the novel I wrote after The Butchers, or Les Champs Brisés. I actually wrote another novel after that project. And it didn't work. It was the first time it's happened to me that I spent many years working on a project that, at first I wrote a first draft and I thought there was potential, but, something wasn't quite working. But I was determined that if I just kept working on the project and thinking about it and evolving it, that eventually it would click. And quite simply, it never did, which was very disappointing, but just a really interesting process to go through. I can't decide, a lot of it was written during COVID. And I think for plenty of people, that was a strange time where it was, all our brains were working in strange and different ways. It was also the first time that I had tried to write a novel that wasn't set in Ireland. I decided it would be a fun challenge to write a novel set elsewhere. But I think actually I just found it really hard to connect with the texture of the place in the same way, compared to Ireland, which I know so intimately. So that project died about 18 months ago. And I was really sad, really disappointed, very disheartened. However, I very quickly started on a new project, and from day one I realized that it felt different. There was that spark. I keep comparing it to being in like a long, loyal marriage that isn't working, but you're doggedly trying to persevere, compared to when you start having this amazing new love affair where everything is shiny and exciting and wonderful and you get swept away. That's how it felt when I started this new project. So the new novel is called The Seagulls, and very briefly it concerns 4 friends in Dublin in drama school in the 1990s putting on a production of The Seagull by Anton Chekhov. And then 20 years later, 3 of them reunite to put on The Seagull again, this time at the Abbey Theatre, which is Ireland's national theatre. So in that time, 2 of them have become Hollywood actors. One of them has a very quiet suburban life. And one of them is not there. I won't say why. But so in a way, the book is all about growing older. It's about the dreams we have when we are 20 compared to the reality of our lives when we are 40, and some of the disappointments, but also maybe some of the possibilities. And also it's about making art. So I am a big theatre lover, and I really love novels about theatre, about plays. So I really wanted to write a novel that was concerned with another piece of art, and eventually I landed on the seagull.
So there's a huge intertextual dimension to this novel.
Absolutely. And I one of the modules that I teach on our creative writing MA at the University of Birmingham is called intertextuality. So I'm kind of obsessed with intertextuality, and it's always very fun at the start of that module. My students say, "What is intertextuality? I've never heard that word before." And then I start, explaining that it's quite simply any text that's deliberately in conversation with another text. And they realize it's everywhere. You walk into a bookshop, certainly in the UK and Ireland, you walk into a bookshop now and there's an entire wall of novels which are retellings of Greek myths told from an interesting or different, maybe female perspective. So it's a very popular thing at the moment. But yes, I realized I had been teaching this module for many years, but never actually done some intertextual writing myself. So again, in starting this new project, I was like, maybe it is finally time. As I said, I had always wanted to write a theatre novel, and then necessarily that would mean writing an intertextual novel.
And since it is intertextual with a play,
yes,
is there any kind of a hybrid form in the novel itself whereby you would have, I don't know, maybe more dialogues or plays within the novel or such,
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the short answer is no, there aren't any. It doesn't change form in terms of reverting to being written like a script. The book is structured in 4 acts, like The Seagull. The events that happen very loosely correspond to the events that happen in those 4 acts of The Seagull. Also, between Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3 of The Seagull, very little time passes. But between Act 3 and Act 4 of The Seagull, 2 years, it suddenly jumps forward a few years. So similarly, between Act 3 and Act 4 of the novel, there is this big jump in time. So I think there are ways in which the structure of the novel is definitely dictated by the play and specifically by The Seagull. But, part of what we talk about a lot during the intertextuality module, and part of, what was really on my mind when writing the book, is that what I've just described to you, if somebody is familiar with The Seagull, I want them to notice those things and think, oh, that's cool. But equally, under no circumstances do I want it to be a prerequisite that people are familiar with The Seagull. So some of that stuff will just be incidental and might just go over people's heads, and that's fine. In fact, that's wonderful. So it's always the challenge when you're working in dialogue with an existing text, that you need to make sure you don't over-rely on people being familiar with it, because then you are necessarily going to lose a certain number of readers or make them feel like they're not in on a joke, which is always a horrible feeling as a reader.
Now, I wonder, when you're in the process of writing a novel like that, do you share bits and pieces with your students?
Oh, God, with my students? Definitely not. I think I have got better at talking about my works in progress with my students. I think previously I didn't do that, partly because it felt presumptuous. When I'm working with them and I'm bringing in examples, I'm like, oh, let's look at some Virginia Woolf, let's look at some Zadie Smith. So it feels presumptuous to put myself on the same level that I would be a useful example to talk about. But I think over the years I have learned that they really appreciate just knowing more about their lecturers' work, and acknowledging that they are being taught by working writers. But B, I think there's a kind of a shared vulnerability almost about, we are all working on projects at the moment, and some of which are going well, and some of which, as I've mentioned, aren't going well. And I think my students really appreciate that kind of candor. And also my intertextuality students are particularly delighted that I'm finally writing an intertextual novel, because they also think it's strange that it's taken me this long, given it's a subject about which I'm really passionate.
I see. So Since you've been working on intertextuality with a play,
Yeah.
I wondered if this had given you, the desire to write plays or go in that direction.
Well, funny you should ask, because it has, absolutely. I mean, I'm not sure it necessarily, I think the desire was always there. As I said, I'm a big theatre lover. I always have been. I did some acting when I was a child, and I starred in lots of plays, like professionally, for a time. But yeah, I love the theatre. I live in London, so I'm very fortunate that I'm surrounded by really, really great theatre. So I go to the theatre probably maybe once a week, like really regularly, just because I love it. And yeah, there are all sorts of ways you can get cheap tickets, and it's kind of, to me, it's almost like going to the cinema. But so I've always loved the theatre. So yeah, that's part of the reason why I wanted to write a quote unquote theatre novel. But also, I think in preparation for this book, kind of as research, I decided I would enroll on a playwriting course. So I actually convinced my university that they should pay for me to do an 11-week introduction to playwriting course. And I think I genuinely thought this was just research for the novel. Like, I did not think it was going to go beyond this 11-week course. And I loved it. Oh my goodness, I loved it. I mean, partly I think I loved, being a student again, like going back to learning. I think as someone, and I'm sure you're the same, that, you spend a lot of time in classrooms, but you're always the one who's in charge and running the class. And so to walk into a classroom and be the person who is taking in the knowledge and just listening and taking part was so beautiful, like really, really great. And also, we read a lot of plays, and we talked a lot about the different elements of playwriting. And I started to think, I think I would quite like to give this a go. This was also around the time that my previous novel was dying. Mm-hmm. So this new novel was still only half an idea at the back of my mind. So it was just nice to be, as something was not going well, to feel like I was in this new space of possibility. So I ended up doing another course. I did intermediate playwriting, and then inevitably, I suppose, I ended up doing advanced playwriting. So I did 3. So I did a whole year of playwriting. And yes, the result is I have now written 2 plays. Wow. Which it's still all very new. So I'm still learning very much. But one of the plays, I was lucky enough, the adult learning college where I did my playwriting courses, they have a beautiful theatre on site, because they do acting courses, they do directing courses, they do theatre technician courses. So they have this really great theatre. So they ran a little competition for a 1-hour play. And anyway, so I entered it and I won. And it meant that just back in January, my play was produced. We just for 2 performances. But it was amazing. Like, it was so the whole experience, and I got to attend all the rehearsals. So I was in the rehearsal room throughout the process. Which was really strange, like really.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. Yeah, it must be very, very strange to switch from writing novels to writing plays, and then, letting the play exist outside your control in a way.
Yes.
So could you tell me a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, and there's novel writing. Obviously, it's very solitary. There is a little bit of collaboration when you start working with an editor, because you have someone who reads it and makes suggestions. And I love that process. I think some people don't like the editorial process because they feel like people are trying to intrude on their work. But I think it's kind of amazing. You get a clever person to read your book and make suggestions for how it could be better. It feels like cheating. Like, it's so wonderful. So I do like that slightly collaborative element. But I suppose fundamentally, writing novels, you can be in complete control. Mm-hmm. So, you write a scene and you can articulate, what a character says, when they say it, maybe they tilt their head, maybe the light is coming in the window in a certain way. You can curate everything down to the last detail. And And I think what I've discovered, or maybe I already knew, is that I am a control freak. So this really speaks to me because I'm able to micromanage what is happening. However, when you write a script and then you hand it over, it just is no longer yours. So, suddenly actors are performing your lines and performing them in ways that do not correspond to how they were in your head. And then the director comes along and says, oh, why don't you try this, and suggest something else that absolutely does not correspond to what was in your head. And just the whole thing just becomes so far from what you imagined. And also you can't do anything. It's not your place as a writer to say, excuse me, I don't think that's how it's supposed to be. So it was a real learning curve for me. And I actually found frankly, I found most of the rehearsals quite excruciating because it was so unusual to me to not be able to affect the final product, and to change things that didn't, for me, feel right. However, the kind of trade-off for all of that is then on the night so we just had 2 performances, as I said. One was at 6:00 and one at 8:00, so back on back. To sit in a theatre and see your play be brought to life with, lights and music and the whole thing. And also to be in the room with an audience as they react to your work. So, they laugh at your jokes and they gasp at the shocking moments, and lots of people cried, and to be in the room while that was happening was like nothing else I've ever experienced. Because obviously people, they read your books and they might tell you afterwards that they enjoyed them, or, you read reviews, you read lots of nasty reviews on Goodreads because that's what people like to do. But to have that, the live experience of someone reacting in real time to your work was so special. So I think despite the slightly excruciating process of the rehearsal room, it did confirm that actually I think this is something I would like to do more of.
Okay. And this is it. I mean, this play is not going to be produced anymore. Is it going to be published, or?
Yeah, well, I think it's funny you ask. I think actually there are some next steps in the pipeline. So we have just confirmed that we are taking it to Edinburgh for the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. They have a big drama fringe festival in August. So we will be taking the play, same cast, same director, same tech team. Everybody was dying to do it again. So we are taking it to Edinburgh for 2 weeks in August. And then also we are hopefully going to be doing the Bloomsbury Festival and the Camden Festival in London. So yes, hopefully this means the play will reach more people. And then yes, after that I would like to explore the possibility of getting it published, because I think it would be lovely for that to happen.
And what is the subject of the play? I mean, how is it related to the novel, or has it got a life of its own? Or
completely a life of its own? Yeah, it's really, and I will just say, before I answer your question, it's been really interesting also in this process. At the moment, yes, I have the novel and I have this play and I have another play. And one of the things I really learned from the previous project that did not end up succeeding was, for so long I only worked on that. And I think it was quite unhealthy, because I was really fixated on this one thing. I never had a break from it. I was, kind of obsessively trying to figure out what was wrong with it and how to make it right. Whereas this time I have multiple projects on the go, and I have felt like my own imagination just really benefiting from jumping between different projects, and just it means necessarily I will leave one project aside for a week or 2 or 3 and then come back to it, and suddenly you have this fresh appreciation and you're able to notice things or have new ideas. So yeah, having these multiple projects has been just such a different approach for me, but really much more productive and healthy. But yeah, sorry, the play. So the play is not in any way related to the novel. The play is, well, I was about to say the play is a climate play. But I think in writing it, part of what I was thinking about and maybe trying not to write was a climate play, with a capital C,
yeah,
capital
I remember
P.
Talking with you in London last year about this, and you were not sure yet what the play was going to be about.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, I think, obviously, like everyone who thinks a lot about, the climate emergency, and obviously as an artist thinking about art that relates to that, I have seen some great plays that engage with climate issues, but also there is a risk sometimes that it gets very didactic, very overwhelming. Like it's a really big topic. So I think I was really interested in trying to write a play that felt very very human, it's about human relationships primarily. The play is all about mothers and daughters. It just happens that in the background there is a climate catastrophe emerging. So the play actually, it's split into three. The stage is split into three, and it follows one woman at 3 points in her life. So firstly, her as a child, caring for her mother who's been diagnosed with cancer. Then her as an adult working as a climate scientist at a university in London, starting a romance with her colleague. And then 40 years later, as an old woman in a care home, looking back on her life. And it becomes clear that at this point, there has been some big climate catastrophe. So now the UK is maybe 50% submerged in water. So across those three timelines, yes, you do sort of get this sense that things have, in terms of the climate emergency, deteriorated quite significantly. But as I said, the play is all about really about her relationship with her mother, and then, this new romance, and also the question of whether they will have children or not. And then her as an old woman looking back on all of that and wondering whether she made the right decisions, etc. So, themes that are all very, dear to my heart, but almost like set against a climate backdrop. So yeah, it was interesting to find that balance where I felt like I was still saying something interesting about our world and how we sort of deal with the fact that things aren't looking totally hopeful all the time, but actually not making that the key focus being human relationships. But it was also a challenge for me because I think this kind of three timeline approach is the kind of approach I always take in my novels. Like, I really love novels, and we have talked about before how you also like novels that have multiple points of view or multiple threads or strands. And, part of the joy is jumping between these and maybe anticipating how they will all connect or come together. But it's less common in plays. It's much more common on stage to have just one location or one set of characters or one storyline. But I was really interested, as I'm thinking across novels and plays, to think, would it be possible to take this kind of 3-strand approach and make it work on the stage? And I think it does. I think it is possible.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. It's fascinating. As far as the form is concerned, as far as the topic, are you, we had this conversation also concerning your conference, but what on writing in climate, not in climate crisis, but writing in times of crisis. Are you thinking of bringing this theme of the climate to fiction, or maybe a kind of side to this question is what do you make of the absence of climate novel, not climate fiction, because there is climate fiction in short stories mainly for the moment in Irish literature, but there's no climate novel, if any. There are perhaps some that we could say, talk about the climate as a subplot. So what do you make of this situation in Irish literature? And do you, as a writer, think about writing a climate novel?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something I will be talking about in my conference tomorrow. But I think so. There is a school of thought, right, that like Amitav Ghosh, the Indian novelist, talks a lot about how contemporary fiction is not really fit to engage with climate issues, that contemporary fiction has become very solipsistic or individual. It's all about, getting inside the minds of millennial women to tell their ennui and their stories, and somehow it's very it's very about the individual. And his argument is that the climate necessarily is a collective problem and a collective challenge, and he also talks about some of the reality of what we're experiencing even now in terms of crazy fires or crazy weather events, storms, whatever. We still associate those. If you were to put them in fiction, it's likely that you would end up writing kind of a sci-fi or an apocalyptic, they belong in kind of genre fiction, whereas kind of serious literary fiction, if you put in a kind of a crazy tornado or something, it would feel strange, but which is hilarious because that is also the reality of what is happening right now. So he has all these kind of reasons why he thinks contemporary fiction is not fit for the task of writing about the climate. And then there are others who, building on this, suggest that actually the theatre is the more a more suitable mode for engaging with these issues, because necessarily going to the theatre, the act of going to the theatre involves sitting in a room with a bunch of strangers and together engaging on this one thing and using our imaginations together. I still find it kind of wondrous that we as adults go and sit in a dark room while people stand on a stage and play make-believe. It's very childish and kind of wonderful, and it's great that we still do it. But I think, yes, so Brian Kulick, who's an American scholar, he talks a lot about how theatre is, as I said, a more appropriate space to engage with some of these climate issues because of that act of coming together, and it is a collective issue and requires a collective form, I suppose. And I think is therefore quite telling to me that, yes, the first time I have decided to engage with climate issues in my work was for a piece of theatre as opposed to for the page. It has never crossed my mind previously to engage with climate issues in my novels. Partly for the reasons I said at the start, which, as soon as you call something a climate novel, I think 50% of people will say, that's not for me. And I think it's part of the wider issue of the way that we all know that something is wrong or something is coming, but also we just carry on with our lives as is because it's kind of almost too overwhelming to try and comprehend. So that kind of dissonance, I think, extends into fiction. However, having written about it for the stage, and I will say that, again, being in the room with people, thinking about these issues together and seeing people react in such an emotive way was beautiful and made me very hopeful, because this idea that we as a group of strangers could feel together and could think about these things together was really inspiring. But I suppose now that I've done that, and now that I've been reading some of these critics and scholars who are making an argument for the theatre being more appropriate than the novel, obviously now I'm thinking, well, I'm going to show them, or that feels like a good challenge, because I don't accept that is that it can't be done, or that it's that novels are too individual to deal with this collective issue. Back to my previous point about I've always loved writing and reading novels that have multiple points of view. So maybe it would be a case of writing something that has more, brings together lots of different perspectives. Maybe that would be, so thinking about the formal choices that I might make towards that. But yeah, I don't know yet, because The Seagulls isn't quite finished. I'm in the final kind of stage of tweaking it before it gets sent out to publishers. So I'm not quite at the point of thinking about what my next novel project might be, but I also think at the back of my mind, it is likely that I might want to explore whether it is possible to write something climatey with a small C, not a big C.
I understand. Yeah, I look very much forward to it anyway. In any case, and also as we discussed, we discussed the latest issue of The Stinging Fly, winter 2025-2026. Which is about the climate. It was called The Climate Issue. And as I told you, I noticed that poetry is also addresses the climate topic in a more positive way, or more positive way than the short fiction that was included in that particular issue. I wonder if you have anything to say about this type of writing, the poetical writing, compared to fiction or drama.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I suppose there's also more of a tradition maybe of poets engaging with the natural world. I think there's a lot of what we might call nature poetry, but just in general, I think that sensitivity and that care and that active noticing that kind of characterizes all poetry there's a great tradition of that being applied to the natural world. And you know, I want to say especially in Ireland. I mean, I can't speak for all poetic traditions, but there's definitely a great tradition in Ireland of there being some really beautiful, again, I don't want to say nature poetry, because that, again, sounds like something I'd say, oh, I don't want to read that. But poetry that really engages with the natural world. So maybe for poets then, for that to be already such an established tradition, the next step of thinking about, well, what if that natural world is under threat? I think that becomes a more logical evolution. Whereas I think, you know, there's obviously quote unquote nature writing, but again, I would always associate that with being something more to do with nonfiction than fiction. I think nature novels, you know, you have novels with a great sense of place, but nature novels are maybe not so much of a thing. So then by extension, if that nature is under threat, again, maybe there isn't so much of a continuum for fiction writers to go down. Also, I think it's just so hard. And again, we've talked about this as a novelist who's reaching for plot to avoid the easy trap of the apocalypse or the big catastrophe, because it, you know, that just feels like such an easy way to inject your book with high stakes and high energy and tension, which is all the things, no matter what you're writing about, whether it's just about two people or whether it's about, you know, a forthcoming meteor. Things you need in novels are, you know, stakes and energy and a sense of plot that's going to culminate in a big event. So I suppose the challenge is also to try and write something that doesn't just fall into another version of there is this coming apocalypse. So yeah, I think that is hard. There are, you know, I think I mentioned to you, like, Keelan Hughes's novel, The Alternatives, that came out last year, maybe 24, which is about four sisters, all of whom have PhDs and all of whom are thinking about or working on the climate in some way. So one is a university lecturer who's a climate scientist, so she's probably the most obvious example. But then one of them is a chef who's thinking about how she can cook in a more eco-sensitive way. One works in government, but is thinking also about how, you know, they can change government policies towards the climate. So it's coming at it from different angles. So again, I think with that novel, most of the time it does a great job of, it's a novel about sisters, and it's about these four sisters and their dynamic, and, you know, they were orphaned young, so they have a very kind of close bond. So their dynamic and their energy and their relationships is what makes the novel come to life. And then it means that some of the climate stuff is there, but it's not being rammed down your throat. So I think she is probably the only, or definitely the best recent example I can think of. And then also I mentioned to you the Bee Sting by Paul Murray, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize again in 2024. Should have won the Booker Prize, but never mind. His novel, there are glimpses, again, it's about a family. So, you know, on the face of it, it is about, you know, a mom, a dad, a daughter and a son. And the novel is told from each of their points of view as the family heads towards financial ruin. So it, you know, it's a very funny book. It's a very dynamic book, but a lot of it is about human relations, etc. But there is a strand running through the novel about the youngsters feeling a sense of anxiety about the climate. The family fortune was made on selling cars. So there's this sense of guilt, or how much have we contributed to this forthcoming disaster. And then there's also a strand where the father is building a bunker, an apocalypse bunker in his back garden to prepare for doomsday as and when it comes. So that's, they're woven in very subtly, but I think hearing Paul Murray talk about that book, that's a very deliberate choice on his part, is to think about ways in which elements of the climate crisis are creeping into our everyday lives and should creep into our everyday fiction.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for this generous conversation. I'm sure the audience will want to see your play as soon as they can in Edinburgh or London. I for sure will go to either Edinburgh or London. And I look forward to reading your future, the Seagulls, and then the future climate novel, hopefully one day.
Yes.
So thank you again, and have a nice day.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Marie.